So we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our second colloquium of the year. This is a little bit late for our second colloquium, but here we are. This year our theme has been STEM education in celebration of the opening of our STEM education Ph.D. program. For the theme, we've cast a wide net to try to get a sampling of different questions in the field of STEM education. Last fall, we hosted Janet Kolodner, who talked about learning in technology-rich and immersive worlds and bringing wonder and awe to science learning. Today, we host Dr. Kristy Daniel, who I'll introduce in a moment, and on May 6th, we'll host Nicole Joseph, who will talk about social barriers to mathematics, particularly for Black girls and women. Each of these speakers is talking about a big issue in STEM education, issues of motivation, technology, communication, belonging, equity, and content learning. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Kristy Daniel from Texas State University. Her research focuses on how people communicate and understand complex science concepts in order to identify best practices for education. This is a timely and important topic given that the body of what we know about how people learn STEM and STEM content in general continues to grow while we have a remarkably small impact on the daily lives of the public, of students, and of teachers. Kristy began her education as a biologist, identifying plants and investigating plant-insect interactions. She has a BA in biology from Westminster College, an MS in ecology and evolutionary biology from Iowa State University. Her Ph.D. is in curriculum and instruction from the University of Missouri, where she explored how people learn and communicate science content using visual diagrams. Dr. Daniel has coached hundreds of people on how to best become messengers of science, and she has published a book on representational competence in science education. She loves to talk nerdy about science and to push researchers to be thoughtful about the language and images they use. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel.
I'll let people get settled for a minute, if that's okay. And those who came in a little late, if you want to grab a snack, you still can. I wanted to thank you all so much for having me here to talk today. I will wait to get started in just a minute, but I wanted to make sure you knew how excited I was to come out here. Yeah, I get to see where Steve works now. So Steve and I graduated from the same program at Mizzou. So I've known him for quite a while.
The cat's out of the bag now.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, it's a good program. At least it was when we were there. I don't know now. I'm not part of it.
You opened the can of food.
No, that's fine. And I want people to be comfortable, and if you need to get up and move around or whatever, by all means. So I do want to, so the title of this actually comes from, has a bit of history to it. So this is science practitioners or scientists, right, engaging in and explaining research as scholars. And I didn't want to just say scientists, I wanted to include science educators and teachers and things within this as well. But SciencePEERS, this acronym, it actually came from a project that I picked up on immediately after I started my position at Texas State, where I had two brand new graduate students that were eager to go ahead and just jump in their first year to do some research projects. I know several of you are first years and can probably appreciate that. And they wanted to work with some pre-service teachers and how they were starting thinking about science and talking about science. So this SciencePEERS actually started from a project we were doing. I'm not going to get a chance to talk about that project too much. It was largely focused on the use of social media as an educational tool and thinking about social media as kind of a science campaign and things like that. And I am still working on that from a different aspect. So if you are interested in that, I'd be happy to chat with you about that at the end. But for now, so that's kind of where I borrowed that title from. It had a little bit different meaning. I have updated the acronym to better suit what we were capturing with that. But I do bring that up because I know a few people were asking if they could kind of follow the lab or look at some of the stuff we're doing. We do have it's TX for Texas, SciencePEERS page on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. We mostly use the Facebook page, but you can always follow that if you are interested in seeing some of the communication pieces that we highlight or some current research that's going on or different things that we like to share. So by all means, I'll bring that up again at the end though. So I was asked to come and share about how we communicate science. And really my work as a science educator really began when I was looking at the role of images and talking through pictures. So I always like to start off with this, and I want you to think, what is the first thing you see? Anybody want to share what's the first thing you saw? You saw what?
I saw beaks.
Beaks, okay.
I was just going to say like the head of a duck or something.
A duck?
Rabbit.
A rabbit? Oh, yeah. Bunny, the ears. So, prior ideas that people bring with them and what their past experiences are really shape with how they interpret things, especially in science. Science is a humanistic endeavor, right? Scientists are people too. And how we think about things really shapes our interpretation of data. And this shouldn't be news since most of you all are in education.
Yep.
And we talk about kind of constructivism and prior ideas, but I do know there's at least one scientist here as well.
There's several.
Oh,
Yeah.
several? Yes. Okay, great.
And mathematicians.
And mathematicians, yeah.
Even better. But I do want to bring it up that when we start talking about communication, we have to consider the same kind of ideas and backgrounds that we're using in education. Because for me, I see science communication and science education as largely one and the same. Because as a teacher, it's my job to communicate to learners what I'm trying to teach them and hopefully get them to understand what I'm trying to teach. I don't know why that went, sorry. I thought this was on silent. I won't hang up. Oh. Okay, it will hang up now. I'll turn it off. I apologize. But this is a really complicated thing that not a lot of people had studied prior to when I got involved in the science education. Some people had looked at how people use graphs and math. A few people had looked at chemistry illustrations, but nobody had really thought about this from an educational standpoint, especially in biology. But I think, like I said, kind of thinking about this line, it really matters because I have an intended message, even for today. I have an intended message I'm hoping to share. But based off of what you already know about what I'm talking about, you might have some very different ideas. Or maybe it's based off what you don't already know. I'm not too sure if you're familiar with this children's story, Fish is Fish. Steve, hopefully you've heard of it. But basically what it is about this tadpole and this minnow that are raised in a pond together, and they become fast friends. But as they develop, the tadpole slowly loses his tail and gains legs. And eventually one day, he develops into a frog and he can hop out of the pond. And the minnow's afraid he's gonna lose his friend. The frog says, no, I'm gonna come back and I'll tell you all of my stories. And this is one of the things that he's telling the fish as he comes back to the pond. And he says, oh, I've seen so many things. Like what? Asked the fish. Birds, said the frog mysteriously. Birds! And he told the fish about the birds who had wings and 2 legs and many colors. And as the frog talked, his friend, the minnow, saw the birds fly through his mind like large feathered fish. What else? And so he goes on to talk about people and cows, and every time the fish is thinking about fish with udders or fish that are standing on legs and walking around. Because all the fish knows are things the fish has seen. And so this is really influencing how he's now interpreting the world. And it's not quite right. As scientists and as science educators, we can really assume that every person we meet has no clue about what you do. Because if we look at the world, less than 0.1% of the population are scientists. So, and even within our science fields and the sub-disciplines that people may be studying and focusing on, we have these tiny little bubbles that as scientists we get stuck in. So I may be in biology, but I really look at like plant interactions in biology. I look at phylogenetics, which I'll explain in a second, or botany, whereas other people in biology might be doing microbiology or molecular biology or physiology. And if they try and talk to me about that, I have no idea. That is not the type of science I do. So even within scientists, when you go to present at professional meetings, you can assume, it's pretty safe to assume, the people in that room aren't going to know anything about what you have to say. Now the issue is, a lot of scientists, about 85% of scientists, think that a major problem is that the public doesn't know much about science. And they're right, the public doesn't know much about science. But the public, a lot of times, they think they're going to rely on anecdotes, they think about the scare tactics, they're self-interested, so they might not value what the science has to say, they're not focused, sometimes they focus on things that are overly sensationalized. But at the same time, when scientists are up there giving their talks or talking to the media, the public sees them as boring. They're not always engaging. They don't know how to relate to the public. And still, the scientists themselves, they're essential players in science communication. And when I talk about scientists, I also talk about science educators or teachers of science when I'm referring to this. And when I talk about the general public, that can also include college students, especially if they're freshmen or lower level, because they're just now getting started. So they're learning. They don't have a big focal point. They're still figuring out what their major is a lot of times. So they're kind of in the same group. So I see parallels between these audiences. And really, one of the things that's hard is figuring out how to bridge kind of a cognitive gap. Because, like I said, what's presented by the speaker isn't always understood by the listener. And a lot of times this boils down to use of specialized jargon or some lack of context. So if you can stop and think about what language you can use to not dumb down your message, but to elevate your audience to the same level you are and to explain what you're trying to get across, and maybe provide some context through examples or analogies or metaphors, you can start to have a shared dialogue, even if it's only one person talking, like right now. But you have this kind of shared system. And that's when you can start making a difference and bridging that gap. Because a lot of times what we're seeing is that we have these communication barriers, like jargon, using very professional language that somebody doesn't even know what it means. This is going to create a barrier. They're not going to understand. All they're going to see is like static or fuzz. And they're not going to get the message. But communication really is a two-way process. And it's only successful if both parties come to the same understanding at the end. And if I'm using some jargon, I have these communication barriers, that is not a successful communication mode. But if I can start removing some of those barriers, thinking about the language I'm using, thinking about the examples I'm using, putting some value on what I'm trying to talk about, that's when you're going to start getting shared understanding. And that's where you're going to have successful communication. And in classrooms, this is going to be where they come to the same conceptual understanding of the concept we're trying to talk about that day. I mean, think about this one. We use visualizations every single day. So visuals can be a really nice step to overcoming some of these communication barriers. But again, it's a two-way communication, right? So visualizations really only work if we both come to the same understanding. Green light, go. Red light, fast. Or stop. Wrong thing.
Faster.
Right? So, yeah, exactly. Yellow light, go very fast.
Yeah.
Some people may say that's a shared understanding. Some people do not. So it really depends. We have to have that shared idea of what's going on. Hopefully you slow down and you yield here. Otherwise, there may be a lot of accidents. Some tells me that may be the case. But we really are trying to get at that shared idea. And it's in practice, not just in theory, that you have a shared idea. And so, like I said, I tend to use visual models or representations as kind of my model for thinking about, or the context in which I think about communication. So a lot of times we have to figure out how to get what's in our head, how we mentally think about something very complex, and figure out a way that we can express that to somebody else, so that way they can then begin to understand what we're trying to convey. A lot of times we do this through the use of visual representations, visualizations. And so our visualizations can either be internal or external. So internal is when you have that kind of mental model, or this mental image. External is when you have something that you can share. Kind of like what I'm doing right now, I'm sharing with you. I have some visuals, and I also have my oral external explanation of what I'm trying to share. And so with externals, you can have gestures, you can have, like I said, verbal explanations, we can have analogies, metaphors, things like that. You can also have some symbolic representations, but we also have these concrete representations. Concrete representations can be anything from a photograph, a diagram, a drawn picture, a graph or a graphic. These are all different concrete representations, or we can call them visualizations. I often flip between the two because I do, I'm sorry. But so if I say representation, I'm considering an external visualization for today. And so this, if you aren't familiar with, these are considered trees, often called phylogenetic trees. They can be represented in a host of different ways. A lot of times you may have heard of them called a cladogram. This is when a branch length, the branching structure has no meaning. It's just there. Or you can have a phylogram, which is where the length of branches actually means something. I like to use these when I start out because this is the only sketch or one of the sketches, the first sketch that we have of kind of a tree that was in Darwin's journal as he was going around the globe on the Beagle. And this is one of the only diagrams in his book that came out, Origin of Species. This one's a little interesting because there's no shared origin like a lot of trees happen to have. But basically it's this idea of how living things are related to each other. It's a central metaphor for evolution. And evolution is a very key concept that we talk about in biology. So these trees have a huge part in biology courses, especially in introductory biology. Now, a lot of times some students may just see them in a book, but other instructors explicitly teach these. Some kind of infer the meaning of these, so they may show them on a PowerPoint slide or something, but not really explain them. It just assumes students understand them. And so I did a lot of work with phylogenetics, or looking at relationships of things to each other based off their genetic basis and their evolutionary history. So I was really interested in these. It was related to my master's work, and I knew of a professor at Mizzou when I first started that used these a lot in his classroom. So this is kind of what I decided to use as almost like my model system. But one thing that I want to say is with visualizations, whether they're animated visualizations or they're static visualizations that don't move, they really need to explain, not just merely show something, but they need to have some information contained in them that can be interpreted, or maybe you can use it to solve a problem. And in fact, that idea of whether you're using it to gain information from it or whether you're using it as a predictive model is actually under this new framework that a group out of Germany has crafted called Model Competency. And so it's a new thing. Actually, the person who's writing the next book in the series, I have a book here I can show you in a minute. They're part of that group, that cohort, or not cohort, the PI lab, that's really bringing this idea of model competence and model competency out into our field. And I really like this idea of how you use images either as an informational tool or a prediction problem-solving tool, because it goes hand in hand with a framework that I've been using for a very long time, which is called Representational Competence. So my framework that I've helped develop and have used to support a lot of my research isn't looking at whether it's an informational source or a problem-based source. It's just the very act of how you're using and interpreting and making sense of the image. So they go hand in hand. Representational competence and model competence can be used jointly to kind of think about how people are interacting with visualizations and using them to help with their thinking process. This is just an example of a representation. It's concrete. This is a drawing. And one of the reasons why I wanted to throw this up here is because this is an example of I think it's a good representation that's actually inaccurate. Because this is a goldenrod, which is a plant that grows in prairies that I did a lot of work on. Spent 2 years going out, getting stung by wasps just so I could look at these wonderful flowers in ditches and roadsides and all the places they love to grow. And I was looking at their host of insects that lived on them and made these weird little growths on them. They're called galls. And what was neat about my master's research when I studied this is there is a community of insects that use these plants. And there are 3 different types of plants. These plants, they're all the same species, but they have a different amount of DNA. They have a different amount of genetic material. Some of them have the normal amount. Some of them have twice the normal amount. Some of them have 4 times the normal amount. They all look identical. If we went out there and saw them, we couldn't tell which plant it was. And they all grow in the same patches. So they could be growing right next to each other, but be very different genetically. I can't tell the difference between them. The insects can. And so the fly that makes this would never use the same plant as the moth that makes this, which would not use the same plant as the moth that made that. So this is just a representation or a way for me to explain kind of approximately where galls may be if you find them, what the galls may look like, and to do it in a simplified way so I can give this to my students when we go out and do a gall survey, but for them to recognize that this particular plant can never exist because it just doesn't work that way. So so for me, knowing that I can actually ask students to tell me how they interpret this and how this applies to their survey study to get an idea of how competent they are with the representation. Are they looking at this as a verbatim, this is exactly what they're going to go out and look for? Or are they recognizing that this is symbolic in some way and it's just a general representation, but they're going to be looking for similar things? Are they going to be like measuring, oh, I'm going to look for something 1 inch above the ground? No, that's not how it works. So I can look at, can they make their own diagram later? Different things like that. So that's going to give me some insights into their representational competence. Because basically, all this means is it's a description of how a person uses their perceptions of reality to make sense and communicate their understandings. And this can change with the nature of the task. So this particular representation is fairly simple, right? It's an observation. It's a kind of guide to do a study. But I could ask some really complicated conceptual questions with representations. For instance, these trees. These trees are what are considered cognitively complex tasks because it relies upon a lot of mental conditioning and mental understanding of these abstract ideas. So you're never going to find something like this like existing. You make these are abstract. And we know that these are really hard. For many years we've known this. So back 2005 is the first time that people have published about what's called the Tree Thinking Challenge. This was a publication that showed up in Science. It was by David Baum, Stacy Smith, and Sam Donovan. And they talked about how this very central metaphor for evolution was being used in classrooms being used all over the place, and students didn't understand it. In fact, shortly after this publication, I went to an evolution meeting. I went to a talk, and the speaker misinterpreted the tree, and that was one of his primary pieces of evidence. I'm like, facepalm moment if I've ever had one. Pulled him aside privately after his talk, and we had a bit of a heart-to-heart. Didn't want to publicly out him on that one. But think about this. So on the basis of this image right here, and I know the text is a little small because of the slide, so I'll read them to you. Do you think the frog is more closely related to the fish or to the human? And it's okay, you can think your answer. I'm not going to pick on you at this point in time. But I do want you to come up with an answer. A few wide eyes. Like, you don't have to tell me, it's up to you. But I want you to remember what you're thinking right now. Everyone come up with an answer? Yeah. Okay. Does this image change your mind? No. I'm seeing some heads nod, some heads shake.
Nope, doesn't
So
change.
the work of David, Stacy, and Sam, what they proposed is they were proposing that based off their observations, a lot of students were thinking that in this one, the frog was more closely related to the fish, and over here, the frog is more closely related to the human. And they said it's because they were closer together on the tree. So that's what they were proposing in their paper. Now, their study was looking at some purely quantitative instruments, asking students to respond about their trees, answer questions, and then they were making assumptions off of those questions. And I didn't necessarily agree with this idea. And one thing that's really nice about working with humans, and instead of working with my plants and insects, I can actually ask a human to tell me why they're doing what they're doing. Whereas the insects, I don't know why they were using different plants. I don't know if it was preference or performance. I just know it was different. But humans, I can ask, why do you think the frog is closely related to the fish or the human? And why do you think these trees are the same or different? And so this is really what sparked my whole transition from biology into biology education. So I started working with these trees. And for those of you who are not familiar with trees, I'm going to give you a very brief tutorial right now. This is a tree. All these intersection points are called nodes. They represent a hypothetical common ancestor. If we ever find a fossil that changes our understanding, it becomes a new branch, which is, or it gets its own tip, right? So it becomes a new thing on this tree. This is always a hypothetical. The tip, the end point, that is going to be a taxa or an organism, or it could be a gene. It depends on what level we look at these trees. And these parts right here, this is considered the branch. This part right here, this bent, that has no meaning. It's just there. It's just bent. And these could be straight. I can unbend them. I can turn this into a circle. And it's not changing the nature of this. So they can come in different shapes, sizes, forms. The important part is to look at the topology or the structure of those intersections, those nodes. Those nodes are really important. And then what we can look at is these nodes, this intersection point. Everything, this is more recent, this is more ancestral. So everything that's more recent from this node and more recent, we consider them closely related. And everything inside this circle, or this clade, is going to be equally related to each other and more closely related to each other than anything not in that circle. That's how we can interpret these trees. That's a very crash course on phylogenetics. And also, we can think of these trees like a mobile. Or some of my students would say, oh, it's like propellers on a helicopter, right? They can rotate. We haven't changed anything about this relationship. Because if you look at the nodes, they're all consistent. And if we drew circles around them, they would still be consistent. Again, I can change that node right here. I haven't changed the relationships in any way. I've just changed how the tree looks. And so this part right here, this is something that we could refer to as spatial rotation, especially mental spatial rotation, because a lot of times these trees are in a textbook or on a PowerPoint diagram, and you physically can't touch them. You can't rotate them, but you can do it in your brain. You can do it in your mind. And there is George Bodner, who's up at Purdue. He did this visualization test, so he could actually measure somebody's mental spatial rotation. And this idea of the spatial rotation, this is very much related to tree thinking. When I ask questions like I did earlier, are these two trees the same? Because you have to mentally manipulate this image, this diagram, to try and determine if these are the same. So, these are equivalent trees, right? I've just rotated branches around nodes, and you can actually look at this if you want to try and do what I call a nested diagram, nested Venn diagram. You can mark each node, you can circle the group from them, and when you compare the circles, they're going to be the same things within each circle. So, same things are more closely related to each other in the circle than anything outside the circle, and so forth. Did you follow that? You still got questions? Okay.
Does that go both ways, though? Like it's saying that the circles all match implies that the tree must be identical? Or is it only the other way? The identical equivalent trees must give you matching circles?
That would be the same either way.
So it's
Equivalent trees will
necessary
give you the
answer.
same circle structure. The same circle structure will give you equivalent trees. Yeah, sorry, I had to think about that for a minute. There's multiple ways of doing this too, and I'll show you a different way of thinking about interpreting this in a minute. But this tends to be one of the easier ways because students can all draw circles. So it works pretty well. But it's still very difficult if you don't have that mental rotation. And so one of the things I wanted to do is I actually wanted to go into biology classrooms and find out what are our students' mental rotation and how is this connected or related to tree thinking. And so we wanted to know how stable mental rotation was as a skill. Does it change over the course of taking a biology class, or does it stay consistent? And we also wanted to know what was the relationship between mental rotation and gender, because a lot of studies have said females just aren't as good as males in this skill set. And also we wanted to look at mental rotation and tree thinking. You know, how do those two relate? Because maybe we could help with mental rotation if it's not stable, and that could help with tree thinking. Or maybe they're not connected at all. I think they are. And we looked at 56 students. This was a pretty even split between males and females, all in equivalent courses. It was an upper level biology course that was focused on trees. And we looked at before and after a class where they really focused on trees. It was an evolution course, in case you wanted to know. And we found that there was no significant change in mental rotation before or after the class. It was a pretty stable skill. And really what I thought was fascinating is that there was no significance between the genders. We have since repeated this study numerous times. Every single time I have looked at mental rotation in biology classes, I have never found a significant difference in mental rotation between males and females. As soon as I step out of biology, I get a difference. It's a correlation. I can't say anything about causation. I don't know if girls with better mental rotation go into biology, if guys with worse mental rotation go into biology, if there's something about biology that helps mental rotation. I have no
I was just
idea.
gonna say, because girls, according to the research, tend to be, more prone to biology and learning biology, right? So it actually goes back to what you were saying prior. It's prior knowledge, so
Yep.
maybe.
So if somebody
girls-
wants to try and explore that, that would be a great study, and I would love to know what you find.
When you say step outside, like where?
Like physics,
Oh, so
chemistry,
not in, like,
engineering,
visual-
anything outside of biology.
Yeah,
What about
that's-
sculpture majors?
Yeah, anything. It could be art. I've even gone to English, and
Okay.
I've gone to multiple disciplines, and I've also pulled from, I did a mass literature review to see where mental rotation was from other people's studies, and in biology, you don't see that significant difference, but in all other disciplines so far that I've looked at, you do.
Because even when you showed that image, I actually
Yeah.
used my prior knowledge. I wasn't even paying attention to trees. I know that that's
Yeah.
what the question said, but I
That's-
used my
happens a lot.
prior knowledge.
This is not
Right?
unusual.
And I'm like,
Just
I know
letting
the
you know.
relationship, and I actually checked your tree, if your tree was correct or not.
Well, that's the one that was published in Science. I didn't even change that. I used that on purpose. But anyway, yeah.
You have these for biology, and then you said when you step outside, whether it's physics or math, you get differences. But what are the levels? I mean, are they?
These are the mean, these are the mean
Right,
scores.
Those are the means for biology.
Yeah.
What are the mean scores?
That I don't have off the
Vary,
top of my head.
you know,
I do
if
know
you're going-
it's
yeah.
a significant difference.
Right, so just kind of wondering if the average level of one is going up, the other is staying the same.
You know,
what the relationship is like as you step outside.
I should go look at that.
You must have the data from when you
Yes, I
described it. It would
do.
be kind of,
I do.
you know, wow, that'd be neat to
I
look
do
at.
have that data, and
Yeah.
I've just never considered even looking at that.
It's right there, just-
That's embarrassing to admit. Now I'm going to go back to my institution and pull up all my old files, because this is actually a fairly older study that we've replicated since. But it was from the start of my project, and I don't really do trees a whole lot anymore, and I'll get to that. But I will. Now I'm going to go home and say that I'm doing an active tree project. But no, I will go and check, because that's a really good point to bring up, to see if these means are even close to what the other discipline means are.
Yeah, I mean, there's something, the other question I have.
This is why I love giving talks.
And, again, I know you mentioned it, but I was
Obvious thing to
processing
look
a
at.
lot, so apologies if you already said it, but you talked about before and after, the mental rotation is kind of an acquired skill. And could you remind me, was that just sort of through the course of the biology class, or were there specific, we're going to now try and train you to do
No, so
better, or
this
was it just kind of
class
naturally
was
through the
just
class?
a course that used a lot of mental rotation. They had to do a lot of mental rotation tasks, but the teacher was not teaching mental rotation.
Okay.
Yeah, every time we've done this visualization test, there aren't really classes that teach mental rotation that I'm fully aware of. I'm sure there are some out there, I'm just not sure which ones those are. Maybe in art, they might do that a little bit more, but we don't often teach that as a learning objective at university. And that's where I was looking. These are all with university students. So when I say male and female differences or not, I'm looking at the university level.
We have a related question, did they get any better at trees?
We're coming to that. So we did find that there was, I'll get to that. So there was no significant correlation between mental rotation and tree interpretation. So like the first question I asked you. But there was a significant correlation between mental rotation and tree comparison, which was like the second question I asked you. And so that brings up to kind of this type of thing. This is an image directly from a textbook, one of the textbooks they were using. This is from Norton, a Norton textbook. But a lot of times when students see this, they kind of see this as like a main branch. And humans are the most advanced. But if you consider the nature of trees and that swiveling aspect, we can easily change the ordering of the organisms and even change how it's presented. And this is the same tree. It's showing the same relationships. but a lot of the students were having different ideas about what this meant. And part of it is because of time. God, Time used to have a book series, not just their magazine, and they had, no, I guess it was Life, sorry, not Time, Life. They had a book called Early Man in 1965, and I shouldn't have hit that, that had a historical representation of when different fossils existed from when they found them. And this was actually, I should have brought that book, but you can actually pull open the page and you can see all of these different hominids and primates, and they're presented in this order. And so this, people were seeing this and showing this as evolution. But in reality, this image ignores the tree that's showing the lineage structure underneath. And so you're missing a big chunk of data. And so this is why visual representations of science is so critical and important, and why I hate that picture. Because we need to kind of see how people are thinking about this, and it's hard enough getting them to understand this without this prior concept that we're having to overcome. I touched it again. Yeah.
Sorry, just confused. So if you can switch the human with the chimpanzee, does that mean the angle of that line is completely irrelevant?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So why is it?
So it could be bracketed, just like
right.
the
So it
previous
could be
trees.
just straight across.
So this
Yeah,
is
that's
actually
important.
one of the implications that have come out of the tree thinking research as part of the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center working group that I was on. And I'll include some of the names of the people that were part of this project. We were looking at styles of trees. We were looking at how people interpreted different trees, exact same content, but just different styles. We've actually gotten, this particular one's from 2009, so it's 10 years old. We've actually gotten textbook and curriculum materials changed. So if you go look at textbooks now, you're going to be hard pressed to find these diagonal trees. Most of them are going to be bracket. Some of them are what I call swoopy.
Yeah.
So they don't even have that uninformative bend, which is also potentially problematic. You still don't see the circle ones anymore, even though the students did best with the circular trees, which you often find when you have a whole lot of taxa you're trying to represent, because the tree is physically too big to fit on a page, so they make it into a circle, kind of like the tree of life. They do the best on that because they don't know what they're looking at. So they start in the middle and they follow it like a maze, and they actually do the best on it, but they hate it. All students hate those trees. They're like, what is that? So even though they do the best on it, it's not necessarily the best way to share and communicate that science, because even though they interpret it correctly, they don't know what they're doing. So that's why publishers have used the research and actually moved to the bracket or the squarish or the swoopy type of tree. Yep. And it's also because that main line. Oh man.
Yeah, I mean,
Because they're like, oh, so chimps branched off humans. I'm like, no. But yeah, I think it's interesting. This diagram, you've probably all seen this, right?
Yeah.
It didn't exist before 1965. I think that's crazy. So anyway, so a lot of the work that I was doing with thinking about these mental rotations and thinking about these trees and how they're looking at, it kind of got into, I wanted to talk about the transition into instruction, how we can put that into practice. I'm only showing you little snippets of the research I did. There were a lot more. But all the work that we did, and there was a lot of people doing tree thinking research at this time. I was able to pull out different milestones. These are just different things that students needed to be able to understand, or the audience, learner, needed to be understand in order to successfully use an image in the way I was hoping they would use that image when I showed it to them. They first needed to recognize and interpret informative symbolic parts. So first they needed to know what mattered and what didn't, right? Then they needed to be able to compare and contrast multiple representations, either different styles or different shapes or different branch structures, and they could explain why one might be better than another. Maybe one tree was wrong because when they rotated it, they actually changed the relationships. Maybe they rotated the branches, but they left all the taxa. I've seen that one happen. They also needed to be able to tell me accurately how they interpreted it or how they thought about it. They needed to make predictions that could support evidence, test and manipulate the tree in some new scenarios given data, and also to generate appropriate and accurate representations to support evidence. Now this is a very, very complex, difficult task. This one's different than the others. These are all what we call tree reading. This is called tree building. And creating or building is much harder than just interpreting something you're given. So this one we found that students could have different levels of representational competence when they're reading than when they're building. But I'm not going to get into that too much today because that's a whole talk on it in and of itself. But what I did manage to do through a lot of different prototypes, I think you saw some of the prototypes, I created a manipulative. And this is actually published in American Journal of Botany, American Biology Teacher. And this is all on camera. But it's now that I've created it and I look at it, I'm like, oh, this is so simple. Why wasn't this my first prototype? It wasn't. It was a way to help teach students about trees where I was taking it off of the PowerPoint or out of their book and making it something physical. So now we can overcome any potential mental rotation challenge by giving them something they can hold in their hands, and then they can actually do a rotation. Or we can do a rotation. So now I don't have to rely on my mental skill, my mental rotation skill. I have a physical skill. And this one happens to be quite colorful. And we were interested in if that mattered as well. So I worked with an honors college student after I created this, and we were interested in, how the differences in tree thinking, the learning gains changed among different interventions, and how did they interact with the manipulative. And we wanted to look at a couple of ways. So we worked with one professor, and we did a kind of quasi-experimental design, where we worked with 163 undergraduates that were split across 3 different sections of an introductory non-majors biology. So students that probably hadn't really worked with trees before, because we were going to try and control as much as we could the prior knowledge and assume they didn't know anything about these. And we had some that just did the more traditional tree thinking instruction. They explained it more like what I just did up here, so they were still explicit about interpreting trees, but everything was done on paper, in their textbook, or on the PowerPoint. Then in one class, we had the teacher teach the exact same way, but to also use a manipulative, so students could follow along. And the third section, we had them use the manipulative, but it was all black. We all used the same color pipe cleaner. And what we found, we did an Anova comparison across the courses. It was repeated measures Anova because we had a pre and a post. We found that the multicolored ones, these had the highest tree thinking gains. And it was more than the monochromatic. And either, it didn't matter what type of manipulative, this one or the black manipulative, if you used a manipulative, you did better than if you didn't have one. So they were both significant. So that was showing a lot of evidence for the use of manipulatives in classes. And especially with the students. We also, because they're people, we get to talk to them too. But in terms of the tree, this is what he wanted to know. In terms of the tree thinking learning gains, they were, all of the classes did show significant gains. So even though this doesn't look like much, it is significant. You can see the error bars don't overlap.
So you said there was a pre-post assessment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the pre-post assessment that I did with the students was a 2-tiered assessment. So I took the same questionnaire that David Baum and Stacy and Sam used, and I added a second question where they had to explain their answer. Mm-hmm. So instead of just the multiple choice, they actually had to provide rationale. And so all of the students across all the sections had significant learning gains, which was really cool. But you can see the manipulative ones had far greater gains than the class without the manipulative. And because I'm, I guess, a really mean advisor, I said, well, that's not enough. That's only 163 students. Let's see if this is consistent. And I had them repeat the study, not with the traditional one, but really just looking at the manipulatives. Or we were looking at this manipulative only. We didn't use the black one. And the standard instruction. And we got 358 more students to do this. And we looked at the accuracy, how many were inaccurate on their questions, and we were looking at the pre and the post. And again, we found, significant learning gains. So what's good about this is, if you actually teach trees, people are going to get better to understand how to interpret this. So the representational competence will increase. That's great. It is not a static skill like mental rotation was in our findings. So it doesn't matter how you teach it, people are going to learn. You just have to teach it. We did another study later with one of my master's students who just graduated a couple of years ago, and he was looking more in depth at the different types of instruction, because we use explicit instruction versus a manipulative explicit instruction, right? And the manipulative was better. So he actually looked at passive instruction. He looked at no instruction. He looked at a control class. He looked at passive instruction, where they just had the teacher put it in the books, put it in the thing, but they didn't directly explain it. He had teachers use a video that's from Tree Thinking, I guess was it, thetreeroom.org, which is from Understanding Evolution, Berkeley website. He had teachers use the manipulative, and then he had teachers do a kind of over-the-top method where they all had the same amount of instruction time. Keep that in mind. If they were going to have 2 days on tree thinking, they all had 2 days on tree thinking. But in the over-the-top one, they did the video, the manipulative, and just kind of talked about them. But there was no added instruction. They just had to do a truncated version of each of them. And he found that actually the type of instruction does matter, even to support this further. Passive was as good as none. And explicit was better than those, and the use of multiple types of representations, so the video and the manipulative and being explicit, was better than just one type. So if you can use multiple ways of showing a visualization, they're going to do better. And it makes sense when you think about how people learn. Different people are going to respond differently to a manipulative than to a video. And if you use a video and a manipulative, you can kind of capture more people.
Quick question. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Well, you both raise your hand at the same time.
I'm not sure if, this is a very interesting study. I just am not sure if it's as simplistic as it sounds. And I know it's not.
Yeah.
I don't think the issue here is using manipulative versus everything else, because the manipulative itself is still the abstraction. Your manipulative was designed to attack a conceptual problem that you already hypothesized.
Yep.
So I feel like this can only generalize to this manipulative, and not use of manipulatives is better.
Right, so I'm not saying manipulatives in general.
So the manipulative, I just wanted to emphasize that, because at least in the context of math ed research, we know that use of manipulative is not automatically making anything concrete, because they are abstract
Right,
representations.
well, and this doesn't make it concrete either.
Exactly.
And I wanted to talk about that, because part of the thing was with the tree thinking, we asked them the tree thinking content questions. Their tree thinking did improve, but I also asked them through some interviews to look at what specific skills were improving. So I actually had them solve problems while I was watching them and having them do some think alouds. And a lot of them were saying when they were doing this, though, this isn't something I can do on paper. So they did see some of that, removing that mental rotation aspect, which was helpful to a lot of our students. But these are the things that they were actually able to do. So they couldn't get everything, but they were able to help improve their visualization of branch rotation. That was one of the biggest things. It was also helpful for reading the trees at the nodes rather than just at the tips and across the tips, which people would say, oh, these two are closer together, so they're going to be more closely related. Well, it depends on where the nodes are, where those hypothetical common ancestors are. So this helped improve that. It switched where they focused. This also helped them with mapping the lineages, because if you look at this, Where does the pink start?
See, that's the biggest advantage. It gives
Yeah.
them an access point to the discourse, which
Absolutely.
otherwise is super abstract to them.
And this
It's
also-
the green thing, but maybe
Right.
it's scientifically it's called the node or something.
And they also were able to look at informative features because I can change this. I could even curl it up kind of like what this one was down here. And they even said, oh, I can do this and it won't change what's being represented. So they were getting that. Now in the monochromatic manipulative, they could not do lineage mapping because they couldn't follow the lineages and they couldn't follow the rotation. So you can rotate this, but then they didn't know where things ended up. We did have some students put little paper on top to symbolize the different taxa, and that helped. But we found too many issues with the monochromatic, but it helped support why we were selecting the multichromatic, colorful one. So in this case, it helped with those specific aspects. So you do have to have a reason for why you're using these. But it did help a lot, and people are using this regularly, and we even had an extra example of, okay, so now you're in the jungle and you find this new thing that's not accounted for, it's yellow. How do you interpret that? And then they actually have to physically unwind this and rebuild the tree to showcase how that fit in. But that's for another day. But really, so if we come back to this challenge, and we think about this, on the basis of this image, is the frog more closely related to the fish than human? After they were using these diagrams, or these manipulatives, what we were finding is instead of using the circle method, students were more using lineage mapping to actually answer these questions, which is a really helpful tool and it can be more accurate. And so once they're doing this, then they can find where that shared most recent hypothetical common ancestor is, then they might circle it. And in this case, we can say, oh, the frog is more closely related to human. If you think about it, it makes sense. They're both tetrapods, 4 limbs, versus the fish. And the same could be done the second one, but that takes a while to do on PowerPoint, so I didn't do the lineage mapping on the second one. So in case you wanted to know what the answer was, sometimes I forget to tell people, but in this case, the frog is more closely related to the human. So anyway, so I've done research on this for 15 years now. Not just me, but also a lot of other people, and we were trying to think of all these different things that go into tree thinking. There's a lot more I could talk about, but don't have that time today. But I did want to at least bring it up. So over the course of a lot of the tree group, and I'm not even going to be able to encompass all of it, we were trying to think about what are the critical parts, what do we really need to focus on in terms of communicating these trees to help make sure what we're trying to represent through this diagram is actually what people interpret this diagram to mean. And also thinking about representational competence. Is this specific? Could it be transferred to something like math? Or is it static, right? Does it change? Can it change over time? Things like that. And so, oh gosh, things have altered a little bit on this. That's okay. So we were looking at the approach people were using. There's a lot of research out there on that, not just stuff from me, but we were looking at, if they were even using the diagram and what they knew about the diagram, or if they were using ideas about ecology or evolution, or what they know about reading a picture. So those approaches could change the tree thinking. So part of the instructional interventions that are out there now talk about how to help students understand what approaches are accurate and which ones maybe are a little flawed, and explain why. We also looked at a lot of instruction, the role of instruction on learning trees. Whether they're targeting just the approach, if they're using manipulatives, if they're, there's all sorts of stuff out there. If they're using, we have little communicules. They're little fake bugs in sleeping bags is what they look like. So they have a lot of things. If they focus on building trees or just reading trees, and which one first. We also look at mental rotation and its role. I'm thinking about visualizations that are actually dynamic in nature in an abstract sense. We looked at task order, even on the form of when we assess them. If we put a tree building task first versus tree reading task first, that impacted all of their answers. We also looked at diagram style. Like this is kind of that swoopy tree I was telling you about. versus the bracket tree versus circular, the diagonal ones. We looked at acceptance of evolution and how that played into phylogenetics in both ways. If students had, we looked at their view of their acceptance of evolution and how that, and based on their acceptance, how they interpreted a tree. And we also looked at, as their tree thinking changed, did their acceptance of evolution change? So we looked at that from both ways. And it wasn't just me, there's a whole list of people who've done this to try and see if one can influence the other. Right now we do show some correlation, but and if they do have strong representational competence on the phylogenetic tree, they do move away from that idea of the false ideas with human evolution, primates, the hominids, the chimps becoming men. So they do move away from some evolution misconceptions, but their overall acceptance is still under debate. And then we also identified the skills, different skill sets that are deeply tied with specific tree thinking. So not necessarily representations as a whole, even though I am working on looking at the transference of that, and I'll get to that in a moment. But these are all the different things that we know about, and also representational competence. We do know that this is pretty specific because we tested a model from chemistry on tree thinking and it didn't work. So we had to kind of redesign the idea of representational competence. But we still don't know if representational competence is really discipline specific or if it's more type specific. So that means if there is a graph, like a bar chart in math, if that representational competence will transfer to a bar graph in science, right? So those are two different disciplines that we're using this image, but it's the same type. So that's what I'm kind of looking at right now. But one of the big things that I got interested in once I got to Texas State is I was able to get some startup money that let me buy some fun new toys. And I have been interested in looking at this thing called eye tracking for a very long time. I had an opportunity to possibly get started in it in Purdue, but it was going to be really expensive because we had to pay per hour of using the machine. But when I went to Texas, I was able to work with some people that had eye trackers that I could get access to without having that huge charge. So now I could start looking at in what ways are people actually using the trees, visually interacting with the tree versus what they're telling me they're doing. Because sometimes people don't always fully understand or fully can comprehend how they're using something. This is well known in reading. So if you look at literature, education, research, people will tell you they read left to right, in America, left to right and down. But in reality, if you look at how they visually interact with text, they jump around, they go back and forth, they go up and down. So how they're interacting with words when they're reading is very different than how they think they're interacting with them. So I was interested in how they're interacting with visual representations to make sense of what I was trying to convey versus how they thought they were. So I was able to work with Oleg Komogortsev. He's actually in computer science. He had this wonderful eye tracker right here that he wasn't using, and he let me borrow it for a few years, which was awesome, until I could buy my own. This is a different system, but it's a little bit more precise. So this is a Tobii system, in case you want to know the brands. This is an SMI system. They are competitors, but they do the same thing. Basically, what's in here is have infrared cameras that measure pupil dilations and can measure exactly where you're looking at on a screen, which is really cool. And there's some weird animations on this slide that I did not catch before, so I'll just make it all go up. So what I could do is I could actually physically draw these areas of interest, or things that I was interested in seeing where people were looking. So if they looked at the question, if they looked at the tip, if they looked at the branches, if they looked at the nodes. So I was highlighting all the parts of the visual. And then I asked students to do a series of tasks, very similar to the questions I've already asked you today. And I was looking at how many times they focused on one of these areas of interest. I also wanted to look at how long were they looking at these different parts of the tree. And I wanted to look at the scan path. In what order and in what way were they interacting with the tree or the question? I'm going to show you some graphs. I've left out a lot of data just to simplify this so I can show you what was the important take-homes, but I do have stuff I can share with you later if you want to know. So really, this is at the university. I got 114 students to come in and do some eye tracking tasks, which we did not pay them. We did not bribe them. I don't know how we got so many students to do this. I think the instructor of the classes that we were doing might have offered extra credit, but that was outside of my knowledge because we did not have IRB for that. But if I didn't know, I couldn't do much about it. I don't know how they found out who was participating or not. All I know is we got a whole ton of people to do this. And it's great because the last time somebody's done anything with eye tracking, first off, it wasn't with tree interpretation, it was just looking at the bends. It was helping us understand if the diagonal trees were better, the squarish trees were better, and so forth. We were actually looking at the interpretation, and we were looking at a class, basically is a functional and an organismal biology class. So they were both introductory biology classes. One didn't do trees at all. There was no tree instruction at all. The other one was pretty heavy with trees. They used phylogenies as their basis for explaining how organisms were related. And so when the students came in, this is post-instruction. We had, you can look at whether they got the answer accurate or they got the answer inaccurate. And what we found is that the students that received instruction, they were able to compare the trees significantly faster than students that didn't get instruction. And the average tree thinking accuracy was improved by about 2 points if they had instruction than if they didn't. So the tree thinking without instruction really didn't change that much if you want to compare the means, but it did go up about 2 points on average afterward. And 2 points doesn't seem like much, but the assessment we were using only had 12 questions. So 2 points is actually a pretty large percentage. And it was a very targeted intervention that we're currently kind of refining. So I can't present it yet, but I can give you a hint. It is called the Betsy, and it should be out soon. And it targets specifically known misconceptions. So ideally, instructors will be able to use that to not only measure gains in tree thinking, but also use it as a diagnostic tool to see potential misconceptions that they can target in their instruction. But yeah. And so I did want to break down what that really means, because eye tracking in itself isn't really that cool until you think about more of the cognitive basis involved with this. So the students that missed this particular question, is the lizard more closely related to a bird or a crocodile? Does anyone want to give that a go, by the way?
More closely related.
I know the lines don't show up as well as on here.
Crocodile.
So if you want to think of how to interpret this, you got to go to the most recent common ancestor of what you're looking for. So that would be here, and with the bird, it would also be here. So you can circle that in all of its most recent common ancestor, or the most recent, everything more recent. So everything is going to be in that circle, and if it's inside that circle, it's equally related and more closely related to each other than anything outside that circle, but there's nothing outside that circle. So in this case, the lizard is equally related to a crocodile and bird. It's a really difficult concept to grasp for them. But the students that missed this question, They spent significantly more time on this task, about 8 seconds more than the people that got this right. And they spent more time, over half the time they spent, was spent going back to the question, trying to figure out what it was asking. And they looked at the tips. They weren't looking at the notes. And so that matters, like how they were using the visual wasn't in a way that we were hoping they were using the visual. That led to more inaccurate responses. We went on, and we're actually doing ongoing analysis of this. We wanted to compare AP students with intro bio. And this all started because, well, I'm an AP biology reader, so that means I get to spend a week of my life in the summer grading AP biology tests. Get to go through about 6,000 in a week. I don't know why I do that. But they always tout that, oh, AP is equivalent to intro bio. So if they get really good scores on these tests, they should get credit for this class. And so we wanted to look at, well, are they actually using like the visuals the same way? Are they interacting with trees in the same way? Are they really equivalent? And in this case, when you look at the correct versus the correct, incorrect, correct, there weren't a lot of differences, but when you looked at the overall AP students versus the university students, the AP students were spending less time and were looking at the trees less amount of time than all of the university students. Like I said, this is an ongoing analysis. We're still trying to figure out exactly what was the cause of that. We don't know if it was they were just trying to rush through it, they didn't care, or if they were really understanding it well, things like that. So we're still working on this analysis, but I wanted to share at least a snapshot of what we found at this point. But it's pretty neat that I was able to get into AP high school classes and collect this data and look at the university students and looking at the data. And after the instruction, just overall, this wasn't significant, but there were more university students getting these trees accurately interpreted than in the AP classes. It just wasn't, I was surprised that wasn't significant, but it wasn't. So there you go. But anyway, so what I'm doing right now is I've actually moved beyond trees. So I wanted to share the trees, partly because Steve asked me to share the trees, but I also wanted to talk about how thinking about representational competence has got me to work with other scientists and other disciplines to think about these issues. So we're moving beyond trees and we're trying to look at type, but we're not trying to look at identical types like the bar graph example. We're trying to look at similar ideas, conceptual ideas that are expressed in different disciplines. So we're looking at geography, physics, chemistry, and biology. And the images that we've selected to do our pilot study all rely upon arrows and kind of this implied movement either through like a food web or that motion of energy transfer, or we have the water cycle, we have dilution, and we also have the lunar cycle. And so we're asking students from the different 4 majors to come in and answer the same questions for each of these 4 tasks. So right now we're having a little bit of issues getting chemistry and physics students to actually show up. So we're still only halfway through our data collection. But we've got all the biology kids, we've got all the geography kids. So we're getting ready to start analyzing this to see if representational competence really is discipline specific or if it could be just type specific. So that would be really exciting, because if it's type specific and not discipline specific, then we have a lot more implications that you can transfer this skill set to different types of representations. But even within biology or in a specific discipline, you really need to make sure that you focus on helping students build competency for each type of representation you're going to present to them.
So what's an example of a common question that you would ask?
Oh, I didn't even put that up here, but like, what does this show? Like, what do the arrows represent? Like movement or something, or direction. I have the specific questions if you want to see the actual tasks.
Just curious in general, like what common question you would ask about these 4 types of representations. Yeah. So what the arrows represent is, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's why I have the arrows, because we actually asked that specifically just about arrows too.
But usually when there is this kind of representations and when let's say arrows are used, there is a key which, you know.
These, actually, in the textbooks, these don't usually have
Okay.
keys with the arrows.
Okay.
But I'm also moving into more informal environments instead of just formal environments. So I'm moving out of the classroom, especially college classrooms, and just getting into learning in general. Because really, we spend most of our time outside of a classroom. That's where we really learn. And learning shouldn't be isolated. Like, our ideas about communication and learning aren't restricted to a classroom. So what I've been trying to do is think about science communication, even with representational competence, even outside of the classroom. I had a project at Mississippi before I left there called Outside, where we took kids outside. We gave them some iPads and different types of representations of the environment and kind of tracked them. I've started working with the Meadow Center, which is actually in Texas, a little bit closer, easier for me to get to. 5-minute drive from my office. And Sarah Salisbury was a master's student who worked with me at the Meadow Center and was really interested in looking at pre-service teachers, how they interacted and were engaged on a field trip, and how that would lead to potential ideas about using such practice in their instruction when they became teachers. And the way we were doing that is we took the ideas that we were getting from the eye tracking work with the representations, and I was able to get a pair of eye tracking glasses. So now this camera could move with you, and it has 4 little cameras right inside that can capture your pupils, where their dilation movements and where you're focusing, and it has a front camera right here. And what it does is it overlays the data, so we can see exactly what you're looking at even when you're outside. So in this case, you can see the circle that's identifying the focal point of what that participant is looking at.
Now, do you conceptualize the amount of engagement a student has based on the amount of times they look at something, or
No.
is it what they look at?
So what we were doing is we were categorizing engagement into 4 different classifications. Behavioral, affective, cognitive, and agentic. What that means, behavioral is how they were behaving in the environment. Affective is the emotional response that they were saying, oh, cool, turtle. Cognitive, I'll get back to in a second. Agentic was when they would take the engagement to a place of relevancy, kind of like what you did when you asked a question. You know, were they actually asking questions? Were they trying to compare what the interpreter was doing to something that they knew? Did they tell a story? Something like that. Cognitive is a little bit more complicated. So you can't just tell what they're focusing on, how many times they're focusing on it, if it's cognitive. But what's really cool, with eye tracking and biometric data, we have this fancy algorithm that we can apply to our data. And it looks at your pupil dilations when you have a focal point. And when you have a cognitive process, we have, not me, but other researchers have found that your pupil actually will dilate when you're mentally thinking about something as you're looking at it. Otherwise, we can have passive focus, which is you can have a focal point, but you're not going to have the pupil dilation. So we can actually identify moments of cognitive engagement based off of our biometric data. And then what we would do is we'd follow that up. We would have the video, we'd have the clips, and we do a post-field trip interview with the students and have them talk to us about what they were thinking through at the moment.
Can I clarify something about cognitive engagement? And I might have misunderstood what you just said. So the ways in which you measured the cognitive engagement was looking at the students' pupils, because the ways you are operationalizing cognition or cognitive engagement as how is it
So this comes out of cognitive psychology. So when you set points like this, because we don't see the pupil moving, we can't do that.
There's an algorithm behind that.
So what they do is they looked at, you have to have a certain, there's a threshold for seconds, milliseconds that you have to have focus on something. And then on top of that, if you have met that threshold of time spent looking at something, and there's the the rapid pupil dilation at the same time, then that triggers what's known as a cognitive engagement moment. And so then what we would do is we'd isolate all of those instances from this video, and we did an interview with the students to have them talk through what they were thinking about in different parts. And every single time that happened, they would tell us something, and she threw in a couple of instances where it was a non-cognitive moment, but there was a focal point, and the students were like, oh, I don't remember, I don't think I was thinking anything, just to kind of spot check or remember check.
Does the algorithm automatically assume consciousness of, because the questions are already retrospective, isn't it?
Right,
Like-
so then that's why she put in the member checking, where she had moments where there wasn't the pupil dilation, and the students can't tell if there's pupil dilation or not. But like I said, the algorithm I did not create.
Yeah, I got that.
Yeah.
I'm not too sure exactly how it works, but in terms of consciousness, they were all awake. I'm not too sure if that's what you mean by consciousness.
I don't remember versus, when I was looking at it, I was also.
Oh, and sometimes they would say, like, I remember something caught my eye, but I don't remember exactly why. So we did have a few moments where they couldn't recall what they were thinking through. And that was fine. I mean, they could answer however they wanted, right?
Okay.
But we were trying to look at these different aspects.
No, this really wasn't about the student's perspective. It was more about accuracy of measurement, so to speak. So I was.
Yeah, it's pretty new, so we haven't really been able to test it too much. And this was a case study of 6 participants, so we still don't have a really strong basis to be able to say whether or not it was completely accurate. But 6, this was a lot of work for her for 6. Yeah. And more, yeah.
I have a question. Sorry, I've been like thinking about it since you've been going through and I just can't figure it out in my brain. So from what I've been reading about representationalism, like from the perspective I've been reading, a lot of times it talks about science being talked about in this idea that we can represent science or that science is something that we can like obtain. And so, does that make sense?
Okay, that's an interesting way of thinking about it, but yeah.
It's something that we can capture or obtain. And so
I've never heard that before.
So yeah, so this is the first time I've read, and from like seeing like the manipulative idea and things that you're showing me, if the students are getting these concepts, it's cool. They can capture it in like in this way. How does that affect them in terms of like their general view of the science discipline?
So that is not something that I've looked at. I do know that how people interact with external representations, whether it's gestures, metaphors, analogies, so forth, and how they explain their ideas about science does give us implication or insights, I should say, into their internal mental models. And now that I think about it, but there's a different field of study that I try not to get into, but I've been drug into a few times, kicking and streaming, of identity research. And they are really looking at that exact question. I do have one graduate student who is insistent on doing identity research, and I know you do it, right? No, who does it? You do it.
Yeah.
It's like, I know one of you is talking about it.
That's why she asked the question. So yeah, you were able to really hit the right point.
Right, so the identity research is a big field, and that's talking about how they fit within. So what my student is looking at, it's identity, but he's looking at it from the viewpoint of sense of belonging. So how connected they feel to the field of biology. Now he really stretched my boundaries, because I let my grad students my doctorate students pick their thesis topics. I try and encourage them all to be within the major umbrella of science communication in terms of an educational tool. And he is looking at student involvement in biology-based student organizations and how that is related to their sense of belonging and identity as a scientist, and comparing that to retention and recruitment rates within our program. And I think it's great, and I hate having to help him on this study because it is so outside my comfort level in terms of expertise, and it has very little to do with science communication, and like, you're killing me. But he's doing, it's his baby, and I'm helping as best I can. And we pulled on an identity researcher because I needed to fill that gap, and several other people to help him. But yeah, I wish I could answer that question, but maybe you can.
Working on it. Chris, quick question. Do the glasses collect audio as well?
Yep.
So so if they speak or they make vocalizations or anything,
Yeah, these glasses are awesome. And you can see, this is Sarah. She's holding the tablet, so she can actually see exactly what he's seeing live. And it even shows any focal points. So she could potentially capture a moment of cognition and immediately talk to them, but that would be disruptive to the
Right,
friendship, so
yeah.
she didn't.
I'm just wondering if there is similar research happening in other disciplines, and I ask that because one of the things you said you were trying to figure out, is it model specific? This notion of model specific, almost pedagogy.
Yes.
Right. And so I'm thinking about my own experience, and I'm like, okay, yeah, to some degree it's intuitive because anytime you introduce a new model, you have
Right.
to teach your students how to use
Right.
that model, right?
But
How to
we don't
interpret that
have
model.
anything in the literature that's captured this with
Wow.
evidence.
Okay.
So that's why the team I'm with, the interdisciplinary team, is
Yeah.
really looking at this. Representational competence.
We've been working off intuitive.
Right.
intuition,
And
all
representational
this stuff.
competence is a fairly new framework, at least
Wow.
in terms of biology, and it has been around longer in chemistry, but not that much longer. Its origin really started within math.
Okay.
And then transitioned into the sciences, and even then they didn't call it representational competency, they called it representational fluency.
Okay.
So it was a slightly different way of thinking about this concept, but if you are in math, that would be a key term that I would encourage you to look up for a lit review. And this eye tracking is definitely new in terms of science education. They have used, this started because of marketing. They wanted to know where people were looking things, products on placements, like product placement on shelves in like grocery stores.
I
Wow.
really don't know if things may even be connected, but this year I learned that a similar analysis was being used for on undergraduate mathematics textbook use through eye
Yep,
tracking.
so it's
Oh,
just
wow.
now starting to take hold. That's partly because these eye trackers are becoming more affordable,
I see.
and partly because we're starting to publish this and people are picking it up, and we're really trying to get it out there. And some cognitive psychologists have helped with building that connection, kind of like that algorithm that did not exist before Sarah's project.
Maybe the team is the same, I
Yeah.
don't know, but I just remembered it and thinking, wow, that's something I didn't see before. So-
Yeah, and also they're seeing this research aspect, because before the eye tracking companies really weren't even approaching academics, they were sticking with marketing.
Yeah, sure,
But anyway, so what we're doing right now is my lab is taking these ideas of representational competence, science, communication, messaging, and the eye tracking, and we're getting ready to start. We've done a little bit of pilot study right now, going out into aquariums and looking at local conservation messaging, figuring out why the aquariums are giving the message, what is their intended message, how are they displaying it, how are family units actually interpreting this and interacting with this, what are they actually looking at, are they looking at the signage, or are they just looking at the fish or something else,
That's kind of
and trying to help kind of resolve some of these issues if there are any. Maybe they're consistent. Doubt it. All the research we have to support this project shows people ignore signs and they don't come away with any conservation messages, which is why we're going to explore this. So this is something I'm doing with one of my doctorate students. And then part of that also, this is part of a big informal science grant that's also pending, but we've already started moving ahead on it regardless of funding, because that's what you got to do. We are partnering with a group in the UK, not just Ireland, it is in North Ireland. There is a project called OPAL, or Open Air Laboratories, that's come out with citizen science activities that are trying to help communicate different issues of science and getting amateurs or the general public involved in data collection. But everything that's involved in this is pretty specific to the UK. So I'm working with that team, and we're going to start creating some citizen science activities that are appropriate for the Hill Country, and we want to come up with a model so that way if people want to take this activity and just replace some of maybe the identification guides with something more specific, it could be easily transferred to different regions. And we want to look at how are people working with within these citizen science activities in terms of the modality that it's being presented. If it's a paper packet, or if it's an interactive online resource while they're outside. And we want to look at how it's influencing their understanding of the concepts, their mindfulness about being in nature, and about the environmental awareness. as well as that kind of science literacy and engagement part. So that's kind of some of the next steps we're taking as well. This also involves a lot of interpreter development, where the people that are often in these informal science centers are often students. They're often undergraduates, at least the ones that are affiliated with universities. Even some museums, they're either currently students or they're recent graduates, and they're taking the general public through and telling them about the content. But a lot of informal science centers don't have funds or time to have a good professional development program. And so I've already started crafting an interpreter professional development model through the outside project I mentioned earlier. And we're going to look at how we can make that more of a model that is going to be easy to implement, develop consistent interpreter relations and communication strategies, and be something that can be transferred across different informal institutions. So that's kind of going on there. And I've also gotten involved, this one's just a little weird, but it comes back to the science communication, and it involves some informal science education. One thing we've noticed, and I think Steve kind of brought up that it's been an issue here too, is a lot of times when kids are getting ready to go to college, they're not fully prepared, and they don't always know how to prepare that. That was weird. So we've been working with community organizations and faith-based organizations to help them figure out how to reach out and find science education resources to help students build their understanding and improve their communication of the skills that they develop to help them be more prepared and more competitive to enter college and hopefully pursue STEM degrees. And lastly, all this research I've been doing has not been for want, so I have to put this in some practical way because I am a science educator at heart. And so what I've done is I've tried to figure out how can I put this and translate this into something more practical in nature that I can share with different scientists in my department. So I've been doing a lot of workshops, especially with AHI. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, where I'll work with them to help them translate their thesis into something that they can share with people that aren't in their field. I have a communicating science class for doctoral students where I'll help them figure out how to present science to SciencePEERS. I also help them present science to general audiences through these 3-minute theses competitions. I know you all have one here. I would encourage everybody to do it. It's fun.
Yes.
I also have them do content presentations as if they're trying to educate, and they have to do video clips for social media. And one of the things there is you have a very different goal for each of these types of presentations and audiences. And I try and base all of the structures and scripts I give them off of the research that I've done and the learning I've done, especially with the visualizations. So what I've been doing is I've basically been scripting scaffolds for scientists. And it's been based off the work some of the work I presented, a lot more is out there, but also work from National Science Foundation's project called Becoming the Messenger, work I've done with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, Commission for Education and Communication, which I am a part of, and National Geographic, which that one you should all know. And also some things from business and a few other things. So we put it together. So like this is kind of my visual representation of how to put together a good elevator pitch. For instance, I can say, oh, I study science communication. Basically, when scientists share their research with others, what they try and say and what they understand really aren't the same thing. So it's my job to identify where those gaps in communications are and how to help create a bridge so that way their meaning ends up being what the audience understanding is. And really my goal is to help make science more accessible for more people by help strengthening our bridges and creating better messengers. That would be my elevator pitch. So hopefully, even if you're not in my field, you know what I do.
Parallels a TED Talk concept.
Yeah. I even have visuals that could go with that. I didn't. Yeah, but it does a TED Talk. The thing is with TED Talks, they can be 15 minutes to up to an hour, depending on their keynote. Whereas in 3-minute thesis, you've got 3 minutes. I do a lot of coaching of 3-minute theses. I've had students in the final placement every year since I've started for 3 years now, so yes. I actually had one of my master's students do a TEDx talk. I helped him do that. But yeah, so I think that's somebody was asking me within my content department if they were, my colleagues could relate to me and respect me for my research. And one of the ways is I show them effective practical applications based off what I do, and they see it work, because I get a lot of my students that win awards for the presentations they do. And so my colleagues then see that, and then it's nice because then they'll come up to me and be like, hey, I need to do something, or my student's going to do a presentation. Do you mind if we help them out? So that's been kind of nice. But I do want to say thank you. As always, it's never just an individual process. I always have a lot of people. I can't even put everyone's pictures up on here who I've worked with, and these are just the more recent ones. But if you can see, like, these are my current graduate students. I have 3 undergrads in my lab. These are my former students from the past few years, and then a lot of my work colleagues from different institutions. But yeah, and all these thank the money, right? But if you have questions, more questions, it's been great. I love the interactive nature of this. This is awesome.
I think the formal time is up, so I want to make sure that we're conscious because it is 5:30 on a Friday.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting it to go that long.
Chris will be here for a little while, but people who want to leave can leave, and feel free to grab a snack on your
And
way
if
out.
anybody what I talked about or a model, if you want to look at them, by all means.
She has copies of the book for everyone. So.
I wish.
You should have brought books to sell.
I don't have any. Like, you
They
have
give
to
you
go
3
online.
copies. Like,
No, what I'm saying to sell,
No,
all the talks